Well, very pleased to announce and introduce our speaker today. I've known Larry Reed for a long time, and I was thinking about the first time we had met. And I believe it was around 1994, and it may have been at a State Policy Network meeting here in Atlanta. I can't remember exactly where it was. But I saw something that Larry wrote a couple of years ago about the Foundation for Economic Education. It had just been announced he was going to be president. And I thought it was appropriate. I'm going to read that to you. He said that FEE believes that ideas rule the world and that individuals can indeed alter the course of events by influencing ideas. Now, countless times I've heard Larry, and in fact, someone asked him one time when he was at the Mackinac Center, what is the mission of the Mackinac Center? And he said, well, we have a long one, but very simply, we want to change the world. And Larry really has done a lot to change the world, not just in Michigan and the United States, but really changing the world, and he's just getting started. He started off in Michigan with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He was their president and was there leading their efforts for their first 20 years. They were one of the early state think tanks, and they have grown to become one of the most influential and biggest in the country. He served as president and for 15 years was on the board of the State Policy Network, which is a loose affiliation of all the pro-market think tanks in the country. And to attest to what he and many others did, when they first got started, there were 12 organizations. And today there are over 50. I think in nearly every single state. In many states there are more than one. And back in those days, the meetings, maybe you had 40 people there. And in Asheville, North Carolina, in our annual meeting last year, we had over 500. And the state-based think tank movement has become so influential over the last 15 or 20 years that people from the other side of the spectrum, like George Soros and others, are now pouring money into trying to start organizations similar to ours, but on the other end. To show you, I think that's a great statement on how successful these organizations have been. You can see from his bio, and I encourage you to read his bio because it's fascinating. It's much too much for me to go into today. But you can see he's a world traveler. And it's not exactly the kind of world traveling that, say, my wife would like to do. And he's got some great stories. But he has been in the jungles with in Nicaragua fighting with the Contras. He has been in Mozambique with the rebels fighting their government. He has been defending freedom behind the Iron Curtain, before the Iron Curtain was just something we read about in our history books. He has done all these things, and he's led a very exciting life. When he's not somewhere around the world defending freedom, he has hosted people from all over the world, teaching them how to promote freedom here in the United States. For about 13 years, the Mackinac Center, they have held these leadership conferences. First, they started bringing in state staff people to train them on how to operate a think tank. And then they started bringing in international people literally from all over the world. And I attended the leadership conference 10 years ago. And Larry, you'll be proud to know, I still have my handbook. And I reference it often. I know Benita's been, and I think you had a lot of international friends with you when you were there. And that has had an incredible impact on training people that go back to their home countries and start think tanks and start this good ideas and get it into the media and shift public opinion, lead to more freedom. In 2008, Larry became president of the Foundation for Economic Education, which is the oldest free market organization in the country, founded in 1946. And it has really been the intellectual beacon during those years with communism and the growth of government in so many different areas, and really laid the groundwork for the victories that we eventually, Reagan, Thatcher, and Pope John Paul had in the 80s, and it's just been a great source of inspiration for all those years. They've featured speakers or authors that you've probably heard of, people like Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, Henry Hazlitt, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, Vernon Smith, Walter Williams, George Stigler, William F. Buckley Jr., and now Lawrence Reed. Now, there's only one thing that caused me some concern about Larry until recently. And I always thought, why would a brilliant economist, someone who is a rational thinker in all other aspects of life, choose to live in a relatively high-tax state like Michigan? Figured, well, maybe it's like you hear about the estate lawyers who don't have wills, or the doctor's children who don't get good medical attention all the time like they should. But luckily, just this year, Larry made the wise economic decision and moved to Georgia. And even better than that, I'm very happy to say that they are opening a branch of the Foundation for Economic Education. They're going to start holding programs right here in Atlanta. So Larry, we are very happy to have you in Georgia. We're very happy to have the Foundation for Economic Education here in Georgia and in Atlanta. We look forward to working with you, and I'd like to ask you all to please give Larry Reed a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to be here, not only as a speaker, but as a new neighbor. And I'm delighted that two members of my staff, our board chairman, Wayne Olson, and our development officer, Mason Drake, are here with me as well. I have known of and have had great respect for the work of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, I think from its very inception. And I have known probably most of your staff over the years. And so the thought that we're now neighbors and able to do some things together is really quite thrilling to me. So I'm looking forward to that very much. I got a kick out of something you said, Kelly. You said, who would have thought that the legislature here in late April would still be meeting? And coming from a state, Michigan, that is one of the few with a full-time year-round legislature, you don't know how refreshing it is to hear people say, it's late April, isn't it awful, they're still meeting. In Michigan, they're meeting all the time. And of course, it shows with sky-high unemployment. For a brief time in the mid-'80s, I lived in the state of Idaho and ran a small think tank there, and they had a part-time legislature that was always done by the end of March. And up until a few years before I moved there, it only met every other year for those 3 months. It was a biennial legislature. Our little think tank led an effort at that time to sort of bring back the biennial legislature. And I'll never forget a state senator who, with a straight face on television in Boise, said why he was opposed to bringing back the biennial legislature. He said, we pass a lot of bad law here in Boise, and we can't wait 2 years to get back and undo it. So we came back and said, well, all right, how about you can meet every year, but on odd-numbered years you can only pass laws, even-numbered years you can only repeal them. But he didn't go for that. So, as Kelly mentioned, the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, is the nation's oldest free market think tank, and we're very proud of the fact that we are about to open a branch office here in Atlanta on Peachtree Street. That doesn't tell you much. There are a lot of those, I guess, but it's not far from here. 260 Peachtree Street will be our initial office location. And we're looking forward to doing more events in the Southeast. And this summer, we will have 7 5.5-day seminars for college and high school students at 3 different locations, and 5 of those 7 will be in the Georgia Pacific building right here in Atlanta. And I'm happy to say, too, that the demand for these programs from students all over the world is just breaking records. We were filled up at all 7 seminars in the middle of March, 2 months before we've ever been filled before. And last year we set an all-time record for attendance at about 700. And they're coming from dozens of countries and nearly every state. 5 of those 7 seminars will be right here in Atlanta. So I hope you will visit our websites, fee.org and thefreemanonline.org. And if the latter one's a little harder to remember, you can get there through the first site, fee.org. There you'll see, under seminars, the agendas, the speakers, the times, all that you need to know if you want to come in and observe any of our summer seminars and hear some of the top flight economists and other speakers that we'll have at those programs. And you'll readily see, as you hear the speakers, that we have a perspective. We believe not only in teaching how an economy works, but particularly how a free economy works. And also, we believe very firmly in teaching students about the moral foundations of a free economy. In fact, our name might suggest that all that we do is focus on economics, but in our minds, the moral fabric, the moral underpinning of a free society, a free economy, is really more important than the economy itself. In fact, it's the indispensable component. You can't have freedom if you don't first have things like the character virtues of honesty, self-reliance, independence, courage, humility, patience, those kinds of things. So we may be a bit unique as an economics think tank in that we combine the character virtues needed to sustain a free society with sound teaching about how a free economy works. That leads us often to talk about the unintended consequences of government action, and which reminds me of an old story about a lady with a pet parrot. I don't know if you've heard this, made the rounds over the years a lot, but this lady had a pet parrot that had a bad habit of repeatedly saying, "Say, fellas, I'm a swinger." Actually, well, the way I heard it, I'm sanitizing it for you just slightly. And it got to be rather embarrassing. So one day, this lady decided she had to do something about it. So she determined that she was going to talk to her priest about this. And he said, "Oh, this is no trouble at all. I have 2 parrots of my own. They're the most religious birds you'll ever meet. They're pious. They say their prayers. They say the rosary. They have the beads. You leave your parrot with mine, and mine will straighten her out." And so she did. And sure enough, after a few minutes, her parrot said, "Say, fellas, I'm a swinger." Whereupon the next parrot turned to the one next to him and said, "Put your beads away, Charlie. Our prayers have been answered." So, unintended consequences. I have for all of you at your seats a copy of our magazine, which we have faithfully published now for more than half a century, called the Freeman. An astounding number of people who have been active or are active in the movement to educate Americans about freedom and free enterprise got their start by something they saw in the Freeman or another publication of FEE or a FEE seminar. So we're very proud of the impact that we've had and that magazine has had over the years. I also want to make you another offer. If you email me at lreed, L-R-E-E-D, at fee.org, I will send you, at no cost to you, 2 monographs, 2 essays, you can read them both in a couple hours, on 2 depressions. One is on the Great Depression, explaining it in the light of free market economics in a way that is easily understood by all audiences. And a second, more recent monograph we've published about the current recession, where it came from, what caused it, the policy errors in Washington that produced this calamity we're still suffering from. So if you just drop me a note, lreed@fee.org, we'll put those 2 monographs in the mail to you, and you'll get a good taste of what we do at FEE and what our perspective is. Today I want to talk to you about 7 principles of sound policy. That is the topic we advertise, right? Okay, great. I'm sort of like Groucho Marx, who once said, "Those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." My principles are firm, but I have a lot of different speeches I could give. 7 principles of sound policy. The purpose of this talk is to share with you what I think are some very important, critical pillars of a free society. And every single one of these 7 that you'll hear is simple. You will recognize perhaps all of them. None of them are original with me. They come from other far more notable people like Milton Friedman and William F. Buckley and so forth. I've just simply assembled them, maybe restated them, added some stories, and put them all together in one package. But they are simple, but they're also extraordinarily profound. In fact, I hope when I'm done you'll be able to look back on these 7 principles and agree with me when I say that if only these simple but profound principles were understood and practiced by our legislators, which is to say, hopefully the folks who send them there have an understanding of them as well, if only they were widely practiced we would be a far different and better place. There would be a lot less mischief in our state capitals and in Washington if these basic principles could be refreshed, reinforced, and if we were to recommit ourselves to them. The first one is this: free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. Free people are not equal. Equal people are not free. Now, I must tell you what I mean by equality in this context. I'm not referring to equality before the law. That is an important pillar that I'm sure there's no dispute in this audience that, yeah, we're all for that. The idea that you should be judged innocent or guilty of something you're accused of based upon whether or not you did it, not according to your national origin or your race, your religion or whatever, but rather your actions and your choices. We sometimes fall short in carrying that out, but it's an important pillar of Western civilization. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more narrowly about economic equality, equality in terms of material income and wealth. That's not to say that material wealth is the most important thing in life. Needless to say, it is not. But it is what feeds and clothes and houses people, makes for a standard of living, solves an awful lot of problems, and without it, we'd be in deep trouble. I'm talking about free people. When people are free, they're not going to be economically equal. We hear lamentations all the time about the gap between the rich and the poor, and that concerns me too. But you know what aspect of it I think we should be focusing on? It isn't so much the fact that there's a gap. We should be focused more in terms of when and where does that gap exist because of the artificial barriers that we put in people's place, in people's way, that prevent them from being all that they can be. It's over those things that we have a lot of control, that we can fix that. But we can't, quote, fix, if that's even the proper term here, the fact that people are different. And those differences will automatically give rise in a free society to vast differences in income, material income, and wealth. I can think of many reasons. I'll only give you three quick ones here. One reason is our talents. Our talents are different one to another. And some people don't discover what their highest or best talent is until very late in life. I'd like to tell the story from my state of Michigan, former state, of a guy whose last name you'll all know. Let me ask you, is there anyone here who's never eaten anything made by the Kellogg Company? Okay. This is a little story about John Harvey Kellogg and his younger brother, Will. It was Will who founded the Kellogg Company a little over 100 years ago. They grew up in Battle Creek, Michigan. Everyone thought, even the family, as these two brothers grew up, that John Harvey would go a great distance. He was the smart one. Will seemed a little slow. People didn't have very high hopes for him. He tried his hand at some enterprises in his late teens and didn't get very far. He was a door-to-door broom salesman for a time, but he had a great timidity at that time, and he would knock on people's doors and kind of cringe and say, you wouldn't want to buy a broom, would you? And that just didn't fly. And so people figured sooner or later he's going to end up working for his older brother. And he did. At the hospital and sanitarium that John Harvey founded in Battle Creek, known for some innovative ideas and maybe some oddball fads as well. But one of the duties that John Harvey gave his younger brother was to prepare, by formula that John Harvey had concocted, the breakfast food for the patients at the hospital. And it was a kind of moist gruel that he made and served. In fact, he had a routine. Every night he'd mix it up and he'd cover it, and the next morning he'd uncover it and roll it out with a rolling pin, cut it up in squares and serve it in bowls. But one night he forgot to cover it. And the next morning when he came in, it had dried out. And when he ran the rolling pin over it, it all flaked up. And there wasn't anything else to do but to serve it this way and hope the patients liked it. Well, they loved it, and they started asking, hey, can you make it that way? We liked it in the flaked form, not the way you'd been making it. And by the way, at this point, he was well in his 40s. He'd been working for his brother, doing this for more than 20 years, never having made more than $25 a week, working for John Harvey, doing this among other duties. He gets this idea, hey, there's a real demand for this. The patients want to take it home with them. We ought to box it up and sell it. So he goes to John Harvey with this idea, and he says, we can make a lot of money and sell it not only to the patients when they leave, but in stores. And John Harvey refuses. He says, that's crass commercialism. This is my formula. It's for my patients. We're not going to do this. And Will pressured him for months, and he never relented. Finally, at the age of 46, never having made more than $25 a week, working for his older brother, Will decided to break out on his own. He was going to make big bucks selling this flaked cereal. He had to buy the patents for it from John Harvey, and their relations were strained for decades. They never reconciled till the end of their lives. He went to Dayton, Ohio, and he tried 3 different dried flaked cereals, and because he figured he could only invest in one, and it turned out that corn flakes seemed to go over the best, so he started making corn flakes. The Kellogg company was born, and right from the get-go, he started making money. He developed he had a talent of marketing and organizing talent that he never knew he had. But he was approached by people who said, if you really want to make a ton of money, you have to break into the New York City market. Then you get Madison Avenue on your side, then you can go national maybe even international. You got to break into New York, not this Ohio and Michigan stuff if you really want to get rich. So he has to come up with a way to break into New York City and, in effect, change the breakfast habits of America's largest city. He comes up with this marketing slogan and program called Wednesday is Wink Day in New York. And here's how it went. He wrote up the rules, he provided the posters, went to the grocers and told them, here's how it works. Put it in your window. If a housewife comes into your store on a Wednesday, he told them, and winks at you, she gets a free box of Kellogg's cornflakes. Well, I see it didn't elicit much response from this audience today, but this is 1900 America. This is risque, for a woman to go into a grocery store and wink at a man who's not her husband. And it took New York by storm. And in no time at all, this was a hugely popular campaign. He was sending trainloads of cornflakes to New York, changed the city and the breakfast habits of the city, the country, sold overseas. Within 20 years of the day that he left his brother's employment at $25 a week, Will Kellogg became one of America's 20 wealthiest citizens. Now, there's an example of how talent affects outcomes in the marketplace. And sometimes we don't discover what our talents are until late in life. Another reason we're different and must produce differences in income and wealth in a material sense is our industriousness. Some people work harder and longer and smarter than others. Our savings is another factor. If the president tonight could somehow equalize everybody's income, and this one might actually want to do that, but if he could equalize everybody's material income, this third factor of savings alone by morning would produce inequality again, because some of us would save it and some of us would spend it. So it's illusory to think that we should have policies that will make people equal economically. They're not equal in so many ways that give rise to differences in income. And when people are being themselves and going as far as their talents and their industriousness and their good sense takes them, we should rejoice in that, not lament in their success. If you're not clear yet about what this first principle is all about, the second half of it will really come home. Equal people are not free. Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. If you could find a place on the planet where everybody is equal economically, regardless of their contribution in the marketplace, they're all making the same, possessing the same, there isn't such a place. It's illusory, but there have been plenty of places who've tried to get there. But if you could find such a place, if I knew nothing else about it, I would say you have found a very unfree place. Because there is only one way in which you could ever even hope to achieve equality of income and wealth, and it is through the use of force. You couldn't get there by speeches. You couldn't get up and say, hey, it would be nice if everybody just had the same. So if you get up to where you're at, where everyone else is, don't work any harder, don't invest anymore, just quit at that point. People aren't going to do that. If you want to make people equal, the secret there is in the word make. The only way you can do it is to put a gun at their head. You'd have to tell them, don't excel, don't be different, don't be better, don't be there first, don't come up with any ideas that everybody else hadn't thought of at the same time. Needless to say, such a society would be fraught with violence and conflict. To try to make people equal, you would be telling people to be what they are not. And you could not hope to enforce or to carry that out except at the point of a gun. Cambodia is a country that within the lifetimes of, I think, everyone in this room, probably went further down this path to achieve such egalitarian utopias than any other place I can think of. In 3.5 years, in the late 70s, under the radical Khmer Rouge communists, they thought it was the good thing to do would be to make everybody equal, except, of course, the leaders at the top. They're special, so we've got to take care of them. But everybody else was going to have what everyone else had and nothing more, and the government would know what all that is. They even redefined the calendar. It was no longer 1975 when they came to power. It was the year zero. They were going to remake everything from the ground up, and we now know the awful toll of that egalitarian experiment in an effort to make people equal. In about 3.5 years' time, the population of Cambodia fell from about 8 million to a little over 6 million. Nearly 2 million people died through famines, executions, the terrible results of a policy of trying to make people what they are fundamentally not. Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. Now you're all sitting there thinking, is he going to take that same amount of time on all the other principles? No, I spend a little more time on that one. The other 6 I go through rather quickly, but that one's important because you have policies proposed all the time at every state capital, and certainly in Washington, that are motivated by this desire to try to make people what they aren't, to try to make them equal by try to pull one guy up by dragging somebody else down. And those policies are fraught with mischief, with harm, conflict, and ultimately bloodshed. Second principle of sound policy is what's yours you tend to take care of. What belongs to everybody or nobody tends to fall into disrepair. You take the best care of the things you can call your own. It's just the way we are. What I'm saying here is that there's a fundamentally sound basis for private property. It makes all the difference in the world. Private property. If you own it, you may make some mistakes, but you certainly have the most powerful incentive to care for it, to husband it, to grow it, to improve it. A good friend of mine who also attended the very conference in Michigan, Kelly, that you've been to, and Benita, is the president of Mongolia. And he's already not even 50, but he's also been prime minister twice. And when he visited us once, he was telling us about his first time as prime minister and one of the things he was most proud of. Of course, he inherited a mess after 7 decades of communism. And he found that all of the yaks, those big hairy cattle in Mongolia, 25 million yaks, that was the number they had, and that was the number they had for 70 years. It hadn't changed. 25 million yaks, not the same ones, but total 25 million yaks. He said, I discovered they were all government property, and I determined that yaks were not a core function of government. So he said, I privatized them all. He sold all 25 million yaks to the herdsmen. I went over to visit him about 2 years later in his office as he was prime minister the second time, and I asked him, I said, what about the yaks? How's that worked out? And he very proudly said, remember I told you there were 25 million for 70 years? They've been private for about 3 now, and we have 32 million. Because all of a sudden, the people who own the yaks have a reason to husband them, take care of them, make sure they're healthy. Private property. How many of you have ever washed a rental car? Now you might say, well, they're private property. Yeah, but it's not yours. So the user is not the owner. So the behavior is certainly affected, and the principle here, I think, still counts. I used to take a camera with me that I loved. It was an old Canon T50 on a lot of these excursions overseas that Kelly mentioned. And when we started the Mackinac Center, our budget was a shoestring, and we didn't have a camera to take pictures of events that we attended or hosted. So I brought mine in, and I said, we'll make this the people's camera. And anybody who needs it to go on the road, you can check it out. And that camera didn't last 6 months. I had had it for, I don't know, 7, 8 years. And here we were, all firm believers in private property. But it just isn't the same if it's not yours. So if you want to take the scarce resources of any society and thoroughly trash them and do so rather quickly, just take them from the people to whom they belong and give them to the people that don't own them. And that's sufficient by itself to ruin a society thoroughly, top down. The third principle, this, those of you who know the name Henry Hazlitt will identify him with this one, and Frederick Bastiat as well before him. Sound policy consists of looking at the long run and all people, not just the short run and a few people. Sound policy consists of looking at the long run and all people, not just the short run and a few people. This is a challenge to be thorough in our thinking. That's all it is. Simple but profound. Be thorough in your thinking. You don't see the whole picture. If all you do is look at the here and now, what strikes the eye, this group instead of that group and all other groups, you haven't got the full picture. And yet every day you see, turn on the evening news, you see examples of a violation of this principle. We judge the propriety of an act or a policy or a law based upon what it seems to do for a narrow few for the here and now, even if it may sow the seeds for disaster down the road. John Maynard Keynes, the architect of much of our post-World War II growth of government, deficit spending, and printing of money, was once asked, Mr. Keynes, if we follow your advice and government gets bigger, spends more, prints money, won't the dollar go down in value someday? His famous reply, taken by those present, I guess, as kind of like the ripest wisdom. Wow, we hadn't thought of that. He said, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. In the long run, we're all dead anyway. In other words, hey, you know, if it helps us for now, this or that group for the moment, why not do it? And if it means problems for people in the 1990s or beyond, well, we'll be gone. Let them worry about that. But as Henry Hazlitt said, today is the tomorrow that yesterday's bad policy advisors told us that we could ignore. And surely that's not a legacy we want to continue to perpetuate and pass on to the next generation. But it's committed all the time, this fallacy of judging something by what it seems to do for the moment and for this or that particular group. An analogy I like to use is of a thief who goes door to door throughout a neighborhood. He gathers up all the loot that he can get his hands on, and he runs off to the shopping mall and spends it. And if all you did afterwards was to interview the shopkeepers at the mall, you might be led to believe this guy was a public benefactor, right? Because they're all going to say, well, he helped me out. Oh, if he keeps doing that, I'll hire more people. He stimulated the economy here at the mall. But you wouldn't be thorough in your thinking, would you? And yet we do. The whole stimulus package in Washington was prefaced upon a kind of violation of this basic concept of throw some money at the here and now at this or that group, and it's somehow good for everybody and good for the long run. That's another topic in itself. Fourth principle, if you encourage something, you get more of it. If you discourage something, you get less of it. If you encourage something, you get more of it. If you discourage something, you get less of it. We are creatures of incentives and disincentives, and we often behave in ways that even the best policy planners couldn't have or didn't foresee, because they kind of thought we'd be sheep willing to line up and be sheared instead of reacting in ways to avoid their impositions. I remember when the first George Bush caved on his no new taxes pledge, and we got higher taxes, including some levies, higher levies on boats, aircraft, and jewelry. I remember well the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office afterwards. They had projected that those higher levies would, on boats, aircraft, and jewelry, would generate about $31 million new dollars in added revenue in the first year, but they only brought in about 16. And they also tried to figure out, well, what was the employment impact in those industries? And they discovered that, in fact, a lot of people had to be laid off because fewer boats and less aircraft and jewelry were sold. And the unemployment outlays to the people who lost their jobs in those industries because of the higher taxes amounted to some $24 million. So it's only in Washington that you can aim for 31, get 16, spend 24 to get it, and think you've done some public good. Because people behave differently than the politicians thought they would. We're not sheep waiting to be sheared, with our behavior unaffected by how much they take. A fifth principle is nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Milton Freeman is known for applying this so cleverly and so frequently. Nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. If you've ever wondered about all the stories of crazy things purchased in Washington when you don't know of anybody who would ever buy such things for those prices on their own initiative, the answer is here. Because nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. It's just a different world. I'm going through these rather quickly so I can get to some questions here, but 6 and 7 I think you'll enjoy. Number 6 gets more specific to government. I've said a few things about government up to this point, but this one really gets specific. It has 2 parts to it. Government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. And a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. Think of that. Government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. It's not like the Girl Scouts selling cookies. It takes it from somebody. It's not a fountain of free goodies. And a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. He who pays the piper will call the tune. There is a trade-off. The best way I know to illustrate this principle is to share with you an old story that goes back, actually has Georgia roots to it, to a man named Tom Anderson who told it this way some 40 years ago. He said there was a group of wild hogs along a bend of a river somewhere in Georgia. You know what I'm talking about? Some of you heard this? This band of wild hogs was a stubborn, ornery, independent, self-reliant bunch. They had survived floods and freezes and fires and droughts and hunters and dogs, you name it. Nobody thought these hogs could ever be captured. One day a stranger came into town, went into the general store, and he said to the storekeeper, "Tell me where I can find the hogs. I have a plan to pen them up." And the storekeeper laughed at him and said, "You'll never do that." But he nonetheless gave him some general directions. And off the stranger went with nothing but a few sacks of corn, a 1-horse wagon, and an axe. And a few months later, he went into the store and he said to the storekeeper, "I've got them all penned up near the swamp. I need some help to bring the hogs out." And the storekeeper couldn't believe it. Others came from miles around to hear the story of how this guy had penned the hogs that everybody thought could never be rounded up. And the stranger said, "Well, it was rather simple. At first, I made a clearing at the center of the forest with my axe, and I put some of the corn at the center of the clearing. And at first, none of the hogs would take any, but after a while, the younger ones would scamper out, grab some of the corn, and scamper back into the underbrush. And before long, the older ones were coming out, taking the corn, each of them figuring if they didn't get their share, another one would get it in his place. So they all started taking the corn regularly as I put it in the clearing. They stopped grubbing for roots and acorns on their own. And about that time, he said, I began to build a fence around the clearing a little higher each day. And he finally said, at the right place, I built a trap door, and at the right moment, I sprung it. His last line was, naturally, they squealed and hollered when they knew I had them. But I can pen any animal on the face of this earth if I can first get him to depend on me for a free handout. If we had time, we'd talk about how that describes the fate of more than one civilization in the history of the world. But I want to leave you with principle number 7. In some ways, maybe it's the most important. And it is that liberty makes all the difference in the world. Liberty makes all the difference in the world. When you think about it, it flows off the lips of Americans so readily, so easily. We take it so for granted anymore. I'm not sure how many Americans could really define it. And maybe even fewer still would give something to preserve it. In any event, it's a far cry from the day when liberty meant so much to Americans. They put everything on the line. It was enough for years after the founding of this country to defeat a bill in Congress, to simply make a case that does violence to our liberties. Didn't matter if it seemed to help this or that group. If it did violence to the principle of liberty, it could be defeated. But today, we judge so little in the way of laws or proposals by the impact on liberty. They're judged instead in terms of, well, what would it do to this group? Would it get me through the election? Does it take care of this problem for the moment? Instead of, what impact does it have on keeping our liberties intact? And yet this is a country once founded. Its very reason for being is liberty. Not just a happy byproduct of something, it is the reason for our nation. And when you think about it, what would life be like without liberty? I think hardly worth living. I wish we could ask the folks of North Korea, what do you think of it? And if they have any concept at all, I think they would be able to tell you something about what it's like to struggle through the absence of it, how precious even a small amount of it is. I'm reminded in my foreign travels about how important liberty is. Maybe more Americans would benefit from hearing from those who have actually not enjoyed it or had it taken from them. I'll leave you with this little story that I'm always reminded of the moment I have any inclination to get down or get pessimistic because a battle didn't go the way it should have in Washington or elsewhere. It goes back to 1986 to a visit I made to Poland. And of all the countries I've visited, I have to say that one, Poland, in 1986, in the midst of communist rule, left the deepest impressions. I spent 2 weeks living with people who were active in the anti-communist underground, the resistance that ultimately prevailed 2.5 years later with the help of the moral support and leadership of people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, John Paul II. But never underestimate what the Poles themselves were doing to help bring those great days about that came in late 1989. But in November of '86, I spent time with the underground in a very dark hour for the nation of Poland. Martial law had been declared previously in December of '81. Solidarity had been banned. People had been rounded up for simply speaking out against the regime and jailed for it, beaten. Some disappeared altogether. It was not at all clear that in 2.5 more years, the Berlin Wall would come down and Eastern Europe would be liberated. Not at all. And I spent every day with people who were active in this opposition, and every night with families who, unbeknownst to the government, were housing me and illegally not reporting that they had a foreigner in their midst. And so they put me in a different home every night. One night, they said, we're going to visit with this group of underground printers. And I was stunned at what these people were doing, taking great works of liberty from the West, illegally translating them into Polish, printing and distributing them around the country. I asked at one point, where do you guys get all the paper to print this stuff? And a young man named Pavel answered and said, well, we get it from 2 places. One, we smuggle it in from the West, and 2, we steal it from communists. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the government has its factories, and they produce their magazines and publications, their propaganda, but the people who work there pretty much think like what we do, and they smuggle the government's paper out to us and sometimes even print our stuff on the government printing presses. But the most remarkable moment was with a couple named Romashevsky, who had run the underground radio for Solidarity in the first 6 months after martial law was declared, beginning in December of '81. They were arrested because they were detected, and he was given 4 years in prison. She was given 3. They weren't out of prison very long when I was there in their apartment in November of '86. They were eager to impress upon me how active they were again in the cause of bringing liberty to Poland, even though they knew they could be hauled off to jail at any time. I asked many questions, but this one in particular elicited a most memorable response. I asked them, when you were broadcasting on that clandestine radio, how did you know if people were listening? And Sophia answered and said, we wondered that ourselves. We could only broadcast about 8 or 10 minutes at a time, and then we had to go off the air to avoid detection. But one night we asked people while we were broadcasting, if you believe in liberty for Poland, the message of our radio, please blink your lights and go to the window and ask, or go to the phone and ask your friends, call your friends, ask them to do the same. And she said, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. They knew how important liberty was. You couldn't tell them that it wasn't worth fighting for. They were willing to give up anything and everything on its behalf, and it's because of that, as much as anything, that Poland, and a continent, unfree barely 20 years ago, is free today. Ideas matter, and liberty ideas make all the difference in the world. Thank you for being so attentive. I apologize for going a little bit on the long side, but if we have questions, I'd be happy to take some. Thank you. Everybody's eager to get back to work.
I'll ask one, Larry. The impact of the healthcare reform most recently, what do you see, and what's our solution? We keep adding debt. You know, you look at the debt figures, you know, people are finally waking up to that fact. It doesn't look like a pretty picture for our next generation.
Yeah, that was a sad day, and I hope it can be undone. I'm one of those oddballs that think that if you really want to solve a problem, you ought to try to go to the fundamentals. And one of the fundamentals we should have been asking ourselves all over the country was, okay, before we give the federal government a new $1 trillion plus responsibility in health care, they've been in health care before, they got health care programs, how have they done? Can we look at what the government has done in health care and say, wow, yeah, let's do more of that? No, we've got Medicaid and Medicare that are on the cusp of bankruptcy. We got VA hospitals that in many cases are a mess. We've got, on top of all of that, you've got an incomprehensible debt burden, an inability to do the most basic thing when it comes to managing public affairs, and that is to produce at least a balanced budget once in a while. And yet now we've taken on a responsibility as massive as this one. It's madness. It's madness writ large. What can counter it is a continued drip, drip, drip until it becomes a flood of ideas of what the pro-freedom actual solutions are. Ideas. Ideas rule the world. And so we have a lot of work to do. I hope it can be undone. But that's the task. I don't think we should accept it as the final word. We ought to work to undo it and get people acquainted with what the private market-based solutions are.
Lawrence, I asked Kelly about this beforehand. Would you encourage folks to pick up a copy of those books in the back if they'd like to have those, or just a gift?
Oh, yeah, Shane says there are some books in the back for the taking. Back of this room or outside?
In the back.
Back of the room. Please help yourself. Thank you. Karen.
What's your reaction to the tea parties?
Oh, the tea parties? Well, by and large, as a whole, I think it's a very healthy thing. I think it's mostly ordinary Americans who are saying, you know, we've been too busy working for a living before to really speak out in many cases, but now our country's future and our fiscal soundness as a nation are on the line, and they want to speak out, and by and large, the message is a good one.
When you mentioned the hogs squealing when they were pinned up, that's what made me think of the tea parties, because people are seeing it close in, the pin close in.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, you don't see Tea Party people generally out there saying, "Hey, give me something further from the government." I mean, the message is one of stop taking what you are, because the more you take, the less we can solve our problems on our own, and we're concerned about what we're doing for our children's future. I think it's a healthy thing. Hope it grows.
The White House has at least 3 more things that it wants to do before November: immigration, climate change, financial deregulation. What concerns you most about the next 6 or 7 months in Washington?
What concerns me the most about the next 6 or 7 months in Washington, I would say, of the things you mentioned, the greatest, the nastiest, I should say, but I don't think it's going to happen, would be cap and trade, the climate change stuff. If that were to pass, I think that would be terrible, massive tax on the economy. But I don't think it's going to happen. I'm guessing that we have seen the bulk of the action of this Congress, other than maybe the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice. That they're not going to. I can't see them taking on yet another massive initiative with the elections coming up so closely. So I think it's going to be we can breathe a sigh of relief maybe for a few months, but that's just a guess. I don't know. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Charles.